Nicola Casarini is a public policy scholar with the Wilson Center's Global Europe program. He joins us today to discuss this notion of either a rebalance or a pivot to Asia, both from the United States perspective and from the EU's perspective. So my first question is, who's farther down the tracks in that regard, the EU or the US?
But thank you for inviting me.
Pleasure.
We had an event a few days ago where we discussed these kind of issues. We discussed whether the United States and the European Union have the same interest in Asia or they are rather competitors. Now, when it comes to the United States pivot, we all know what it means. I mean, it's a major rebalancing towards Asia, possibly one of the most important foreign policy shifts in American foreign policy in the last decades. And of course, it affects the European allies. And we had discussion in Europe as to whether follow the American lead in Asia or come up with our own autonomous position on many issues. And the debate has become polarized in two camps. We have member states and policymakers in Europe that they think we should follow the United States lead in Asia. Others, they think actually, we do not have binding military alliances, we do not have troops in Asia. Our economic interest would be better protected if we come up with our own independent position. In the end, it will be a compromise between these two positions. So in the future, we will have both alignment between the two, between the European Union and the United States in Asia, especially on security issues. But when it will come to economic interest, we will see more and more competition.
So where, if you were going to identify the areas that are most ripe for cooperation, what would they be?
I think it will be the areas of values and security. The new foreign policy chief of the European Union, Federica Mogherini, who is now the high representative of for foreign affairs and security policy, declared in September 2014 then that the two sides, the European Union and the United States, should pivot together to Asia. When she said that, in my opinion, she implied we have the same values we would like to promote. We can name them: human rights, democracy, the rule of law. So we have a joint stake in promoting this kind of values, and also we have a shared understanding and a shared interest in promoting Asia security. So it's both about values and also about making sure that the regional order that has made possible for Asia to grow and prosper in the last decades will not be disrupted, in particular by a rising China that could be a force for good, but also maybe elicit some kind of like friction with the neighbors. So that's like where we can see a lot of cooperation in the next years.
And speaking of China, the obvious, we have to get at some point to China. If not the 800-pound gorilla, perhaps the 800-pound dragon would be a better way to phrase it. But is there agreement between the EU and the US on how to engage China, or is this an area for potential dispute?
Both, again. This agreement when it comes to like trying to socialize China, try to cooperate with China, hoping that China would accept this existing international order and become, as Robert Zoellick said in 2005, a responsible stakeholder of international society. The transatlantic allies are united on that, in the promotion of certain values, in cooperating with China, in having a responsible China in the international society. However, when it comes to the economic interest, the two sides, the United States and the European Union, are competitors. Here we also have a major difference, which sometimes is not fully captured by the American audience. It's not about only economic cooperation between the Europeans and the Chinese. There could also be a factor of competition between the transatlantic allies. In the last decade, sometimes major decisions by the European Union, like I give you two examples. The decision to go ahead and deploy its own satellite and navigation system, which is called Galileo, or again, to promote the use of its own currency, the euro, the European common currency. In these two cases, for instance, China would lend support to Europe in a situation whereby, especially in the case of Galileo, there were some resistance coming from the United States. So now, it's not only when it comes to China, a case of economic competition, there's also a strategic difference. Whereas sometimes the Europeans use the Chinese card to increase their own standing internationally. So when we speak about the global Europe or European Union as a global player, we can take China as possibly the best example that has allowed in the last years the European Union to emerge as a global player.
You make some recommendations in the Wilson Brief that you've published, which people can find on the Wilson Center website as well. And we only have about a minute left, so I have to ask you briefly about some of your recommendations. The establishment of a transatlantic forum, closer links between Congress and the European Parliament, the U.S. Congress, and a regular dialogue between the Department of State personnel here and their EU equivalents. Let me ask you to summarize. It's all about better communication. How close are we to any of those things happening?
There's already informal exchanges, but my indications are we need, because of the things I was saying before, because of the extent sometimes of the differences between the transatlantic allies, we now need something more structured. And that's why my indications, my suggestions were do it both at the state level and State Department level and the cabinet of Mogherini, for instance, the new one. Do it also at the Congress, European Parliament level, so you can engage representatives from both the European Union and the United States in this kind of discussions. And finally, a transatlantic forum. That was just like a suggestion whereby you give more structure to a discussion which is needed to avoid misperception and eventually sometimes even kind of like a rift between the transatlantic allies. So we don't want to have what we had in the past, 10 years ago, when especially China, question like the arms embargo, brought up a kind of like rift between the transatlantic allies. So we want to avoid this kind of things, and I think discussion and the structured dialogue are the best options for the next years to avoid these things and increase the areas for cooperation.
Great. Well, thank you for joining us. Look forward to speaking with you again.
It has been a pleasure. Thank you.